something very, very bad happened to Micah. You see, his file in the city records hall had disappeared. Nobody knew where it was. That means all of the information about the day Micah was born, Micah's school record, Micah's police record, all his financial information, all his health information was not where it was supposed to be, and nobody knew where it was. It made everyone in town very anxious and very nervous, and everyone felt really bad about what had happened to Micah. Everyone was very, very sorry. But to be honest, for Micah, every time someone walked up and said, "Oh, we're so sorry this happened. Oh, yes, so sorry. Couldn't have happened to a kinder person. So sorry." That felt weird and kind of yucky. And in fact, the day they had a big town meeting to talk about it with everyone, it felt even yuckier. You see, the teacher stood up and offered to write down everything that had happened leading up to the disappearance of Micah's file, so that no one would ever forget it and it would never happen again, and it would be in the history books. But Micah knew that there was lots of things in those history books that had happened lots of times and were still happening. There were still wars, there was still slavery, there was still all sorts of things. History books didn't make people stop doing something. And then the town engineer stood up, and she was a very, very smart woman, and she had made lots of amazing projects, and now she had proposed, with huge blueprints and plans, a new records building that was safe and secure and would have big signs, "No entry," and all the security features possible. But see, Micah remembered all the times that buildings were supposed to be built or parking lots finished in a certain time period, and because of the weather or because of schedules or because of all sorts of things, they didn't end up the way they were supposed to. And those signs, everyone always thought they were the exception. Micah was getting very tired, and this was not comfortable. And then the banker stood up and with much gravitas said, "Micah, the whole town owes you a debt for this terrible thing. The bank is going to take responsibility and offer you a check." Now, the money sounded good, really good. But Micah knew that when people offer you money and ask you to sign a piece of paper, that money's probably not the right amount. Then the mayor stood up. She looked very sincere, and she looked very tired, and she looked Micah right in the eye, and she said, "Micah, we are so sorry. This should never have happened to you. I feel bad, but as a community, we feel bad. We do not think you deserved this. And here is the proclamation I stayed up all night writing." And it was pages and pages of words about how bad it was and how bad they felt and how they never wanted to do it again. And the mayor said, "And I've signed it. And all the townspeople have signed it. And the teacher has signed it. And the engineer has signed it. And the banker has signed it. Now you can sign it. And we'll all be on the same page." Micah took a look at that page, looked at the pen he was being offered, and realized he wasn't on the same page, and he didn't want to be on that page. So he said, "No, no, no, no. I won't sign it." Everyone in the meeting was aghast. The mayor looked shocked and insulted and maybe angry. "Well, what do you want?" Micah thought about it and said, "I want you to come to lunch. Come to lunch at my house." And everyone looked at him kind of oddly. And the mayor said, "Well, my schedule is very busy." And the engineer said, "I'm in the middle of a project." Micah said, "I'm asking for 2 hours of your time. 2 hours. I don't want your great big building to keep records in with security features. I don't want money from the bank, maybe. I don't want a history book. I just want 2 hours." And so they agreed. When they got to Micah's house, he had prepared an amazing meal. And they all found a comfy seat around the table, and they sat down, and as they ate, they started telling stories and getting to know one another. And they talked and talked and talked. They learned that the mayor had 2 kids that she absolutely adored, but didn't get to spend a lot of time with. And there was a judge's decree that said how much time she would get to have, but it didn't feel as good as just being with them. And they found out that the banker had grown up in a little tiny house with a huge family, and everyone was always working together and trying to make sure everyone was taken care of. And the banker was very proud now to have such an important job where lots of people could make sure their families were taken care of. And the engineer said she always worried about breaking the rules. And she was asking questions at the table like, oh, do you mind if I reach across the table? Do we pass right or left? Where do you want me to put my fork down? Because she wanted to make sure she wasn't stepping out of line. And she did the same thing with her projects, always making sure they followed the rules and that codes were upheld and everyone would be safe. And from the teacher, they heard amazing stories from generations and generations ago who had lived on this land, and how the teacher was worried that people were forgetting about those generations and the work they did. And Micah shared a story too. Micah talked about how when he was born, his hand wasn't shaped the way they expected it to be. And other parts of his body didn't quite work the way it was expected to. And how that's what was in Micah's records. And Micah was worried that people would just remember him for the way he was different. And he loved the ways he was different, but there was a lot more to him besides the shape of his hand. And Micah told them about how in 3rd grade he had gotten in trouble for writing in permanent marker all over his chair, and he didn't want people to remember him as the kid who had written all over the chair with permanent marker. And there were other records in there too. There were other things about Micah that were true, but they weren't the only things about Micah. And they weren't more true just because they were written down. And they weren't more complete just because they had been filed away somewhere important. Micah was scared that people would stop seeing who he was every day and only remember those pieces of paper in that file whenever it was found, wherever it was. In fact, they talked a lot about pieces of paper. So that proclamation the mayor said was a lot of words, but maybe it was just a lot of words. And those pieces of paper, green with dollars on them, were also just paper if nothing changed. And the sign saying keep out only mattered if people followed the directions. And history books are just that. They're books. Everyone sitting around that table started to understand why it was such a bad thing that happened to Micah. And Micah looked around the table, and as he saw them beginning to understand, beginning to know what it felt like for him to have this bad thing happen, he began to forgive them. You are very, very loved.